communities and families that believe in that process. And I think part of the belief in the process comes from that it's not a million miles from what we do now. We already transplant. The only thing we're doing is taking the patient's own cells and genetically modifying them. I don't think there's any eugenics, anything for people to worry about here. All we're doing is treating serious disease with gene therapy, and I think it's going to run and run.
Good. Well, I'd like to ask you sort of a few more questions about you. On this show, if you like, we are a community network, and we always ask what you would do if I gave you £1 million. I haven't got it, but let's pretend for a moment. Something for the community, what you would do with £1 million. And then I'd like to ask you, really, you've already kind of answered this, what community means to you. I keep saying Brexit told us we're divided. Well, we've had an election now for people who are watching from home, and I wondered for you, what the community means to you, and what would you do for the community with £1 million?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. So, my end of medicine is very fancy, and we get a lot of money. We get a lot of money through the NHS, and we get a lot of money through research. And we get a lot of money from very generous people in the public. For some reason, the National Health Service decides that if you're doing a bone marrow transplant, you get more money. So the hospital earns a lot of money from my work, from the work of my team. But what I also see is very underdeveloped areas of medicine, even within a city like Manchester. And I see, and my wife tells me all the time, that the money that I get for my research and for my kids and my children with cancer, she doesn't say we shouldn't get it, but she points out what it could be done in other areas of the NHS. And so I think if I had £1 million, I would give it to children's mental health services, to speech therapy, to autism and the like. Because I think these are underdeveloped areas of medicine where what is actually a relatively little amount of money for me, £1 million, we would spend £1 million in a week on the bone marrow transplant with some of our drugs and things, and we're paid by the National Health Service. But there are cuts in CAMS and child mental health services, speech therapy, autistic children's services, safeguarding across this great city of ours, and I think that's where I would put that money. Community, what does it mean to me? Well, I think I've talked a little bit about the community on the ward. I said that I went from Cambridge to London. I was quite an unhappy student at Cambridge. I was a poor kid, poor emotionally kid. I was stuck in Liverpool Football Club and things like that at 18. And I went to Cambridge and met lots of people who I now recognise as Boris Johnson and his mates. But I was overawed by them, and I had a big chip on my shoulder as coming from a state school, and I very much regret my time at Cambridge. And I also very much regret that lots of the kids in Liverpool who were cleverer than almost anyone I ever met in Cambridge never went there. But I went to do clinical medicine in London, and I had to choose between a number of different London medical schools. And I chose the London, which is in Whitechapel in the East End. And the reason I chose it is coming out of the tube station at Whitechapel, and the London hospital is in front of you. And in front of it is a market, a fruit market and a whatever market, mainly run by Bengali and Bangladeshi immigrants. And that's what medicine and community is to me. You've got the hospital, but it's embedded in a community, and it's embedded in a multicultural community. People who give us so much. I learned so much from the Bengali people in the East End of London, and the many other ethnic mixing pot that is the East End of London. And that's actually what we have in this great city of Manchester. That we have, and I couldn't be happier than seeing the ethnic diversity that we see in our hospital and what we all learn from each other. And in some ways, there are some similarities. When I was in London, the political discourse was the language of hate of Margaret Thatcher. And when I see a lot of similarities between this election, when this election with Corbyn and his policies versus Johnson, and when Thatcher won in 83, 84 against Michael Foot, and on the back of a victory in the Falklands War. And I think she was a very principled politician, just maybe not my principles. I'm not sure that Boris Johnson has any principles at all. And I think when I look at the community that we have, we must stand up for what that community is, which is built on diversity, which is built on differences, which is built on listening to each other, which is built on learning from each other. And in some way, our responsibility must be to get that community discussion into the political arena. And I so admire what you're doing here. I don't know how you have the energy to do all these things. And I don't often talk like that, but it's the opportunity to say something.
Well, you're right. We try not to be political, but...
well, I'm sorry then.
I'm only joking. Well, you're right. Just on politics, before we leave it, Paul Goggins, who was a Labour MP for Sale, was an amazing man. You and he were instrumental in bringing to Manchester a donor unit so that children, adults who need transplant, because of the mixing that we could have, and there aren't very many in the country. I think there was about 2 before the one in Manchester, and he was a great man. He was very supportive of that. And I wondered, in that process, did you get political, or have you always been political?
I think Paul Goggins was a truly great man, and I think he was a politician rooted in a community. His background was obviously in Oxfam, working in Oxfam. He was my MP in Sale, what we did was, what he led was as an initiative for women that were delivering in St Mary's Hospital in Manchester, was to donate their umbilical cord blood of their newly born child. And umbilical cord blood is a bit like a bone marrow, and we use it for transplant. And the reason that we did it in Manchester was exactly the reason we just said, which is Manchester is a multi-ethnic city and there's diversity, and what we need is diversity when it looks to transplant donors. And so we set up that, and actually we're one of the largest collection centres, but we're also probably one of the largest cord blood transplant centres. We use cord blood, as you know, a lot, especially for children that we can't find donors for with other sources. And what we see in our work every day is that cord blood as a donor cell source is very different than bone marrow. It's actually much better in our judgment at clearing leukemia than bone marrow. And we've actually trying at the moment to set up a trial for cord blood transplant in kids with autism, and we've been funded most of the way by Peter Gabriel for personal reasons of his, and we just need to get a little bit more, and we will transplant kids with autism because there's lots of evidence that cord blood is rich in not just blood stem cells but other stem cells that affect the rewiring of the brain. There is no doubt that autism is an organic disease, it's a physical illness, and there's no doubt that current therapies are relatively limited, and so we hope to open that trial in Manchester. And it's a shame that Paul isn't here to see the thriving bank that we have, the kids that we cure with cord blood transplantation, and this next generation of work where, even though we're haematologists, we're using stem cells to treat non-hematologic conditions and see if we can make a difference in that direction.
Fantastic. Rob, I've got 3 questions for you. I think I've lost track of the time. Right, we all have. So, my next 3 questions, it's all good. Really about inspiration, who inspires you, and then a little bit about only a quote that you live by, and perhaps some of your favourite music, and a book. So, have you got any particular inspirational people that have keep you going? You mentioned your
Good
wife.
question.
I'm sure you'd say your wife always.
I would say my wife always. We're both in medicine, and so we've sort of, and our careers have been interlinked, trying to run 2 careers, as many of you will know. So we moved from Edinburgh to Cardiff, but she could only get a job in Swansea, so we were then we came to Manchester, and so I got a job in Liverpool. So we've worked our careers together. Children, of course, 3 children, all left home, which is fantastic. And love it when they come home, but one's doing Arabic, studying Arabic in UCL, and that means we see the world with her. We were in Lebanon and Syria and Palestine this summer. One is a bird biologist, so he always was interested in birds, and I always tried to tell him, look, keep your interest broad, and he went to Oxford to do biology, and I said, no, leave the birds alone, do some genetics, do some lab work, keep your interests, and he went through his time at Oxford. Now he's still at Oxford doing a PhD, but it's just in birds and bird migration, so, and he's very happy, and it's good that he never listened to me like I didn't listen to my dad. And our younger son has just started in medicine in King's, so he's going to follow that route. I think in day-to-day life, family of course, but the kids on the wards, my colleagues, I've got some fabulous colleagues, kids, parents, members of the team. In terms of inspirational colleagues, there's a great fella called Ed Wraith, and I'll mention him by name, and he was a fellow that was interested in metabolic diseases, kids that are missing enzymes. And when I came to Manchester, as I came as a young haematologist, relatively new, as I said, to children, and I'd never heard of these diseases. But here was a fella, very, very clever, and had spent his professional life looking after kids with these enzyme deficiencies when nothing could be done. And so he looked after them as they died. He looked after their families, he looked after them, and he taught me a lot. And then over these 20-25 years, we have moved initially with him to transplant the kids. So although the patient had an enzyme deficiency, the transplant from the donor would provide the missing enzyme. And we've become a world-leading centre for that. And now we do the same thing, but we do gene therapy. So we take the patient's own bone marrow, put in the enzyme gene, and drive the enzyme production in the body. And we did all that work together over 25 years ago, and he sadly died 2-3 years ago, and is not living to see the gene therapy that will transform these diseases from illnesses where kids die in early life to diseases that we think will be manageable and kids will live and they will develop as normal. So he was an inspiration to me because of his commitment to his patients, without the expectation or the reward of cure, or the rewards that we get from seeing kids get better. He didn't have any of those rewards in his life, and when the kids did get better, it was only because of our work in transplant. So I think he's an inspirational colleague, and I try and remember him in any of the talks that I give, saying what Manchester's doing for stem cell and stem cell gene therapy. Music, so yeah, I sat with my daughter when she's just back from uni, and we went through the music. So what have I got? Well, I think we're going to have to put You'll Never Walk Alone first. I'm very sorry to say that in Manchester, but we felt we had to say that. Then there is the hymn Abide With Me. So my family, my dad was an economist, and they're the generation of people from Liverpool before that were engineers and the like, and my father's father was Fred, and he was a naval engineer, a naval ship designer, backstreets of Liverpool kid, whose son went to university, the first one out, and then his grandchildren all went to universities, Oxford and Cambridge and the like. And we owe him a great debt, and obviously we all miss him. But his favourite song was, his favourite hymn was "Abide with Me," and so it always makes us think of him when we're listening, when we listen to that. And I'm trying to remember what we decided with the third one.
Don't worry, we'll have it for the radio.
And,
but have you got
so many.
A quote that you live by, or a book? I was trying to remember when Peter Arkwright came.
We have. So my favourite book is Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, and I don't know why. There's such strong characters in it. I mean, Bathsheba, the female character, Gabriel Oak. The poor dog that drives the sheep over there, you know, it's a sad tale. There's serendipity in it, their lives keep crossing. And there's the tragic character of Fanny Robin, who is with child by now Bathsheba's loathsome husband, and who dies in a poorhouse through a misunderstanding about which church to meet at. So it's a captivating book, and we have lots, and all the family love it, and we have lots of quotes. So when anyone's done anything particularly well, we will say the quote that Bathsheba says. So she's taken over a farm, she's a woman, she's doing a fantastic job, and she says to her servants, she says one morning, I shall be up before you are awake, I shall be afield before you are up, I shall have breakfasted before you are afield. In short, I will astonish you all. And so we quote that a lot when there's... and then of course there's Shankly, football's not a matter of life and death. It's more important than that. And there's a great banner on the COP at the moment, actually. The COP is a very political place. And the banner on the front of the COP on the right-hand side for me says... the power of the people is greater than the people in power. And I think for all of us, in our day-to-day work and the influences that we have, that is something that I take from the COP home and into the clinics with me.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to stop. Thank you very much. Can we give Rob a round of applause?
Thank you very much.
I know that took a bit longer, but I hope you appreciate. No, it's not criticism. I think we could have carried on. This is an opportunity for people to ask questions directly of Rob. If you ask a question that is inappropriate, I won't take it. I think people who come regularly know I say that, and no one ever has asked that. But Rob is happy to answer whatever questions you have. Oh, sorry. There's a problem of sitting here.
First, thank you very.
Could you say your name?
Yeah, sorry, it's Philip. Thank you very much for acknowledging the other services. I do quite a lot with mental health services and the art estimate. That's great that you acknowledge that. Just one thing that sort of I'd like to pick up on. We're talking about autism as being a disease and a cure. I'm autistic, and I didn't find out until I was 60 odd years old. So what sort of age you talking about? Because I know if I'd like to be cured and sort of live with it, it's part of me. It's just a sort of...
Great questions. So yes, first of all, back to mental health services. I think there's a lot of very poor planning in a nationalised health service that could be got right, and one of them is that some areas of medicine are less well endowed with money, and I think mental health services is one of those. And they're not less well endowed because they're less effective at getting people better. And coming to autism, yes. So a huge spectrum from within that term, and of course much of it will have no need for cure, no need for intervention, and that spectrum is part of the spectrum of all of us and humanity, and what we recognise as being us. But some of autism in children can be damaging, can be associated with poor quality of life. And there's no doubt, I think, from my child psychiatric colleagues that it's not particularly responsive to psychological treatments, and that there is some difference in wiring which may be amenable to transplant treatments so that children's lives are of better quality. But it would only be at that level where there is damage, where there is impaired quality of life, and where it's amenable to therapy. And I'm a haematologist. We're at the very beginning of a road, and it's something that creates a lot of debate within that community.
There's lots of ethical issues because there's always the two extremes, and as you get towards close to the centre, what becomes, what needs to and what's. It's really
absolutely, and engagement of people like you and the community, like in all our areas of medicine, is very important. Not just so that we're not viewed as being paternalistic and making decisions for people, but actually so that we learn. We learn what we should do, what we can do, and what we should do, and that they might be different. Because we can transplant, should we transplant is a different question. And many of the diseases that we look after, many of the illnesses, I mentioned sickle cell, should we transplant that? And so there isn't actually much difference between that question and the autistic question. There is a spectrum of illness in sickle. Should we transplant it? We would only transplant it if the child were ill, if the transplant were to make it better, at a proper risk, and with the right involvement of the community, of the sickle cell community, and of the parents of the child themselves.
It is different that I'm as horrendous as a child, and I'm sure had it been available, I would have been the first one to get these sorted.
I want to reassure you, we're talking, if we offer therapy, and we're just beginning to think about that trial, we're talking about autistic spectrum disease at the most severe end of the spectrum. Children with very poor verbal communication, which obviously you don't have, and very impaired quality of life. And I promise you that we will tread carefully, we will listen to everyone in the community.
Can you say your name when you ask your question? I forgot to say that.
Richard Kilpatrick. So you mentioned sickle cell, and you mentioned T-cell treatment as well. And obviously T-cell treatment has been something that has been around for 20, 30 years. Why do you think that it's taken so long for T-cell treatment to become a regular practice?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I recognise T-cell treatment as being around so long. We know that when we do transplants from donor to recipient, from normal donor to patient with cancer, we know that the benefit is done by T-cells, but also much of the risk is given by T-cells, because my T-cells will recognise Sally's body as different and attack it. They might also recognise her leukemia as different. And so we're trying to refine that. We make transplants safer by better matching. We make transplant better by using cord blood, but we may be able to make it better again by manipulating the T cells. I think there's lots of reasons why it's taken a long time, some of which are in the lab, that getting the genetic manipulation to work effectively. The way we put the gene in has evolved over many years. What we actually use is HIV. So when you're infected with HIV sticks its genetic material into you, and then every bit of you then has the HIV. So we use HIV, but we make a synthetic HIV virus so that when it infects the cell, it sticks the DNA in, but actually the DNA is what we want. So for those kids with an enzyme deficiency, we make an HIV virus that carries the enzyme, it doesn't carry HIV, and we use it to infect the stem cell. And when it infects the stem cell, it delivers the enzyme gene, and then we've corrected the genetic condition. And actually, it's taken a while, it needs to be properly policed and regulated. I think there are some terrible stories of gene therapy over the last 20 years where people have gone too quickly from the lab to the clinic, and I'm not entirely sure it hasn't gone the other way now. It is so difficult to get us from anything from our labs to the clinic. We've just opened these trials, but it's taken 10 years of hard work to get through the regulatory stuff, which of course is necessary, but I have lots of families over those 10 years have said, we know you have a treatment, why don't you give it to us? And it's, so there's a balance to be had there. So I think it's a very good question. I think